All right, hello, hello. Welcome to the last topic of Unit 2. This is on VSEPR, which we're going to talk about what this means here in a second, and bond hybridization. Here is the learning objective, quite lengthy, although to be honest with you, most of this second part here with the X's, these are telling you things that we don't need to cover for the AP exam, okay? So I'll be sure to mention these things as they come up, things that you don't necessarily need to know. But here is the learning objective. Based on the relationship between Lewis diagrams, VSEPR theory, bond orders, and bond polarities, explain structural properties of molecules, and explain electron properties of molecules. So today's video is going to be a focus on what VSEPR theory is and how you can use it to determine molecular geometries and bond angles. In the next video, we're going to break down some of this other stuff, including like hybridization, hybrid atomic orbitals, things like that. Okay, so like I mentioned, this is sort of going to be part one, trying to keep the videos a reasonable length. So we're really just going to cover what VSEPR theory is, molecular geometries, and bond angles here in this first video. We'll get into dipole moments and bond hybridization in the next video. And actually, in class, we're going to do some examples of how to determine molecular geometries. I'm not going to make a separate problem-solving video. I want us to actually do this together. So, what is VSEPR? Okay. Well, VSEPR is a theory or a model that is used to predict the shapes of molecules. Okay. So the shapes of molecules, that should say strongly, influence its behavior or their behaviors. Slight differences in the shapes of chemicals can vastly change how they interact with their surroundings, okay? So like in your body, it's really the shapes of chemicals that determine how things behave. I mean, obviously there's other factors in play, such as polarity and intermolecular forces, which we're going to get into in the next unit, but the shape itself can determine whether or not it fits through something or whether or not it has the right shape to bond to an enzyme or to interact with a protein, things like that. So the shapes of molecules, definitely something that's very important and something that we need to understand for the AP chemistry exam. So the VSEPR model is called the valence shell electron pair repulsion model. Okay, that's what this acronym stands for. The model states that the structure around a given atom is determined principally by minimizing electron pair repulsions. Okay, so we're going to explore different molecular geometries or shapes that arise in various situations according to this model. Okay, and we really are just going to sort of march one by one through a few of the different geometries that are possible. Okay, so the first example we're going to look at is a very simple chemical or compound. This is BeCl2. This is a compound that disobeys the octet rule. Okay, you'll notice here around beryllium there are no lone pairs. So beryllium here only has 4 valence electrons. That can happen sometimes, as we've seen in the previous couple of topics. Some atoms are okay with breaking the octet rule. Okay, so in order to determine the molecular geometry of this compound, we're going to utilize the VSEPR model. Okay, and this is the question that we should be asking ourselves. Every time we're trying to determine the geometry of something, this is the question we should be asking ourselves. How will the bonding pairs orient themselves in order to minimize the electron pair repulsions? Okay, so basically what that means is this bonding pair here is 2 shared electrons, right? This bonding pair here is 2 shared electrons. All the electrons are negatively charged. Okay, therefore, this bonding pair and this bonding pair will repel away from each other. Okay, so they're going to arrange themselves. The bonding pairs are going to sort of orient themselves or point in directions so as to minimize the repulsive force. They're going to try to sort of maximize their distance apart from one another. Okay, while still being around this central atom. So, in 3-dimensional space, 2 bonding pairs can minimize their repulsions by pointing in opposite directions, okay? And that results in what is called a linear structure, okay, where you have beryllium in the center, your 2 chlorines on the outside, and this is a bond angle, okay, so the angle between the 2 bonding pairs of 180 degrees, Okay, if they're pointing directly apart from each other, that's essentially a line, right? And so if you had to draw an angle there around some fixed central atom, that would be a bond angle of 180 degrees. Okay, so that one's fairly simple. The next one is also relatively simple. This is another compound which disobeys the octet rule, BF3. Beryllium and boron are sort of the two two elements that tend to sort of disobey the octet rule sometimes on the lower end, right? Rather than expanding the octet, they actually can have less than 8. Okay, so notice once again, there's no lone pairs around boron, right? It only has these 3 bonding pairs, so we end up with 6 electrons around boron. So once again, if we want to find the geometry, or if we want to determine the geometry, we have to ask ourselves this question. How will the bonding pairs, these 3 bonding pairs, how will they orient themselves so as to minimize the electron pair repulsions? Now, if you look at this Lewis structure, which is a correct Lewis structure, by the way, okay, you might think, well, maybe this is the structure, right? But that is not the case, okay, not in reality. This Lewis structure is okay in terms of showing us where the electrons are and how many electrons are around each atom, but it's not good at showing us the actual structure, okay? And here's why. Notice that the bond angle down here from this fluorine to this fluorine, that would be 180 degrees, but then these bond angles here would be 90 degrees each. That's not gonna work, okay? We're trying to minimize the repulsions. These 2 bonding pairs would have more of a repulsion on each other than, say, these 2. So the actual structure is what is called a trigonal planar structure, okay? The 3 bonding pairs can minimize their repulsions by sort of arranging themselves in something of a triangle. Okay, so if I go back here, if I take these 2 fluorines here and sort of bend them down a bit to achieve this sort of triangular structure, that is the true molecular geometry for BF3. Okay, this is called trigonal planar. Okay, it's like a triangle all in the same plane. Okay, all 3 bonding pairs and the bonded atoms lie in the same plane. Okay, so what would the bond angles be? Well, I like to think of it this way. A full circle, right? Imagine drawing a circle around this central atom. A full circle has 360 degrees. If you divide that circle into 3 equal parts, that's going to be a bond angle of 120 degrees. Okay, so the bond angle between these 2 bonding pairs here is 120 degrees. Okay? All right, from here it gets a bit more complicated, but it's not too bad. So let's look at this example here, methane, CH4. This is the Lewis structure for methane. No lone pairs anywhere. Okay? So upon first inspection, you might think that this Lewis structure is actually a pretty good estimation for the molecular geometry, right? This would be, if this was true, this would be a square planar situation. Okay, rather than trigonal planar, it would be square planar, right? Because we have 4 things, and the bond angles would be right angles, right? 90 degrees. However, we have to consider that space is 3-dimensional, not 2-dimensional, right? So this Google slide is 2-dimensional, right? And so if we were restricted to only 2 dimensions, then this would have to be the shape, right? But we have 3 dimensions. We can go into the screen and out of the screen. That's sort of the z-axis, right? We can go in or out of the screen. And we can utilize that space to further minimize the electron pair repulsions, okay? So this is the shape. It's called the tetrahedral shape, or this actual thing here is actually called a tetrahedron, okay? Basically, it's like a pyramid, okay? It's like a triangular pyramid, okay? It's called the tetrahedral structure, and the bond angles are 109.5 degrees. I want to actually pull up this simulation, and I would encourage you to do the same. While you're watching the video, actually, if you want to pause it and go to this link here, there's a simulation that allows you to play around with the different structures, okay? You can do real molecules, or you can just do models. I think the models are cool. So you can click and drag. So here's an example of my BeCl2, my linear structure, right? You can click on an extra atom there to add an additional bonding pair. This would be my BF3, okay? So I can sort of move this around and see how it's a triangle, trigonal planar, right? All on the same plane. Here's what happens when you add a 4th one, Okay, watch what happens. Okay, you see that? Let me take that away. All right, so you see how they're all in the same plane here? Look what happens when I add this fourth bonding pair. Okay, these, keep in mind, it's these sticks here that represent the electrons. They are the things that are trying to repel away from each other. As I add this fourth one, it sort of comes in from the top right side. It's going to push these other three bonding pairs away. Okay, so watch that happen again. You see that? It comes in and it sort of pushes them away. And so my result is this sort of triangular pyramid shape, which is referred to as a tetrahedron. Okay, and it's actually nice and symmetrical, right? You see how I can look at it this way, and then I can sort of turn it around and it looks like it's just flipped upside down. You see that? It is nice and symmetrical. These bond angles are all the same, okay? These bond angles are all 109.5 degrees, okay, away from each other, all right? And once again, that is called the tetrahedral shape. So I would encourage you to play around with this tool. In fact, that's what we're going to be doing in class, is we're going to be playing around with this tool to help us, once we draw the Lewis structures of things, we're going to come and then build it in this simulation. And we're gonna discover whether or not we were correct or not in terms of our predicting the bond angles. Okay, so let's get back into the presentation here. Okay, so that's tetrahedral. All right, there are two other common structures that are very similar to tetrahedral in nature. Okay, these are called trigonal pyramidal and bent. And I realize they don't look at it at first glance, but let me explain how they are similar. Okay. These are the same shape, but you have to understand it's not just the bonding pairs that do the repulsion. If you have lone pairs on the central atom, those act like bonding pairs. They're still pairs of electrons that are there that are able to repel the bonding pairs away. Okay, so let's go into the simulation again and let's try to build these. All right, so let me take all this away. All right, so the first scenario here is ammonia, NH3. This is nitrogen with 3 bonds to hydrogens and then 1 lone pair. So I'm going to do 3 bonds to 3 hydrogens. Okay, this would be trigonal planar, but I have a lone pair on my nitrogen. This lone pair of electrons is going to act just like that fourth bonding pair, okay, and it's going to push the other ones away. Okay, so you see that? This lone pair of electrons here is in an atomic orbital, okay, or in an electron orbital, and it's going to push these other bonding pairs away. And so it's still the same tetrahedral shape, but in terms of the atoms that are present, the only things that we could really see with our eyes, right? We don't really see these electrons up here. What we see is called trigonal pyramidal. It's not trigonal planar because they're not all in the same plane, but it is trigonal, right? Because we have the 3 hydrogens here, and they're in sort of a pyramid shape. So that is where this structure comes from, okay, the trigonal pyramidal shape. And bent is the exact same situation. So bent is a good example of this is water. Okay, so let me take everything away. H2O, so here's my 2 hydrogens. This would be the linear structure, right, assuming that I didn't have any lone pairs. But in water, around the oxygen, there are 2 lone pairs, okay? So when I add those in, I still end up with basically a tetrahedral shape. You can imagine, here, let me take one of these away. So you can imagine like this looks more like a trigonal planar situation, and then as I add, let me get this oriented how I want. Okay, as I add my second lone pair, it sort of comes in and it pushes these others away, right? And so I still end up with that same bond angle, okay, of approximately 109.5 degrees. The actual molecular shape, though, is bent, right? Because I only have 3 atoms here, the 2 hydrogens and the oxygen. I don't see these electron pairs up here. All I see is the bent molecular structure, okay? So this is called bent, okay? So once again, I would really encourage you to play around with this. It's going to help you a lot in terms of visualizing and getting good mental images of what these things look like in your brain, okay? All right, almost there. I want to say one quick thing about the bond angles in those 2 examples. The bond angles in trigonal pyramidal and bent structures actually aren't exactly 109.5 degrees. Even though they are fundamentally tetrahedral shapes, the explanation for this, which I don't think is assessed on the AP exam, okay, so you may not need to know this, but I'm going to say it anyways. The lone pairs, okay, so this lone pair here and these two lone pairs here, they actually exert slightly more of a repulsive force than the bonding pairs do. Okay, the explanation is that they're actually like closer to the central atom, and you guys know due to Coulomb's law, if charges get closer, the force goes up, right? So the bonding pairs here, the fact that they're actually closer to the central atom, it causes them to exert a bit more of a force. And so what happens is the lone pairs on the central atoms essentially squeeze the bonding pairs slightly closer together than they would be in a normal tetrahedral situation. So the real observed bond angle in ammonia is 107 degrees, and the real observed bond angle in H2O is 104.5 degrees. Once again, I don't think that that is assessed on the AP exam, and I'm not sure I'm going to be asking you about that on our summative assessments, okay? All right, there are other structures that you are responsible for knowing. In order to keep the video, relatively short, I'm not going to go into all of these details. Some of these we're going to look at in the simulation, okay? You can find these tables on page 342, 343 in your book. We've already talked about linear, trigonal planar, and tetrahedral, and then also trigonal, pyramidal, and bent. There are some other structures which you are responsible for being able to work with. Trigonal bipyramidal, octahedral, seesaw, T-shaped, and linear. Okay, these structures usually occur, in fact I think they almost always occur, whenever you have atoms that do not obey the octet rule. Okay, so we're talking about things like phosphorus and sulfur that can expand the octet, that can have more than 8 valence electrons. Okay, you can see here that in the trigonal bipyramidal situation we have 5 bonding pairs, right? So that would be 10 electrons, and then in the octahedral situation this is like 6 bonding pairs, so that would be 12 valence electrons. Okay, so there you go. We're going to be doing some practice with this in class. There is a pretty comprehensive process that you can just follow to accurately predict the molecular geometries of any molecule, assuming that you have the correct Lewis structure. Okay, so in class we're going to be spending some time working on making sure you can do correct Lewis structures, and then once you have the correct Lewis structures, you can basically count the number of lone pairs around the central atom as well as the number of bonding pairs, and that will enable you to predict the molecular geometry of the molecule. Some of you that had me in class last year will remember we did this. Okay, we did sort of a simplified version of this last year. Okay, so I think that is it for the video for today. Yeah, we're going to pause right now, and we're going to come back in another video to talk about dipole moments and bond hybridization. Okay, thanks for watching.